Hey, Jeff, thanks for being here.
Good. I'm glad I was able to put that coffee cup down while you were
It
saying
was
that.
perfect
Thanks.
timing. Perfect timing. Um, so when we were talking about this, we've both been in professional services for what seems like forever, and we were joking about, what's new with the phrase digital transformation to what we were doing, over 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I was curious, what do you see as, what was digital transformation before it was called digital transformation, and what's different from then versus now?
Yeah, I'm laughing, and I think you know why, is that my first digital transformation was and I'm going to date myself, 1997. And I was actually, it's a really cool digital transformation story where I was working at a law firm that was representing very large brands that everyone here knows that were constantly getting sued about the same things. And so back in the old days, the legal team, like the paralegals, would go around and the lawyers would tag stuff with these little flags, and you'd go photocopy them, and you'd send off just boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff to people. And so, so we did the streamlining thing where all these documents that were always being used in these court cases were scanned in. They had these numbers, they're in a database, and when this car company is getting sued about this catalytic converter, it is time to send out this collection of documents and send them out. And the reason why I really like that story is because it encapsulates how I think about working on digital transformations these days, which is following a jobs to be done framework, right? Like we were talking about a job that's being done that was going over and over again, doing the same thing and causing a lot of expensive billable hours. But it's very clear what needs to happen. And a lot of people, when they think about these big digital transformation projects, they might approach it for the wrong reason. Like, oh, we need to rip and replace that software. We need to do X. We need to do Y. Mm-hmm. And I think people are getting a lot smarter, at least what I've been exposed to over the last couple of years, about what are the jobs the users are trying to do, right? And if you can approach things from there, especially in sort of the agile frameworks and mindsets that have come about and gotten a lot more popular over the last few years, you realize, like, let's work on the most important things first and then go from there. And then, fold in all the fun architecture work and things like that. But it's still, I feel, too broad of a term, but it's enough of a term that people understand what you're doing. But I can see 5 projects I did over the last 5 years. They were all digital transformations, and they were just dramatically different, right? Where you're talking going from on-premise software to being in the cloud. You're talking about, going from paper to digital, all these different scenarios. So I think it's very important to frame that somebody else, what would be a dramatic digital transformation for some people isn't really that much for somebody else. It depends on the level of tech, the level of maturity of the company. You could be a 200-year-old insurance company and you're still doing everything on paper, and that's a dramatic digital transformation that needs to happen to keep up with your client base, because they're like, this is ridiculous. And things. So I'm going to just realize I'm going to go down a long path of why people need to work on these things. But I'll stop from there, and hopefully you got something tangible out of that.
Yeah. I love the jobs to be done framework, because at the end of the day, it's like, this job has to be accomplished. Can you make this better? Can you change the way that this job is being accomplished? Are there unmet needs that you can now meet? And is technology part of that, for sure, right? But there's all these other things, and it's funny getting back to that. Is this digital transformation? Like, were mainframes and terminals?
Oh yeah,
digital transformation.
But if you think about it, just for people that weren't part of this, if you were doing a swap out or you're going from one thing to the next, the first thing you would do would be a massive amount of business analysis, where you get together a grid of features, and then you just basically have to map up and make sure you're getting all those features. And nobody ever went in and said, "Do you need to do this? Do you need to do that?" It was like, no, everybody's going to complain if they can't do the exact same thing, right? And I always talk about the big green button, which was when we were building some custom software for some people, and they were getting off of another piece of custom software, and they were like, we need the big green button here. And it was literally a green button. And it was like, well, what, and we're not going to sign off on this project until the green button's there. I'm like, well, what does the green button do? And like, oh, well, now it enables us to get the current report and export it to Excel. I'm like, okay, so you need export to Excel functionality so that you can do what? And they're like, oh, so that we can run our formulas on it, right? And so you start, as you know, in the consultant thing, just ask 5 questions and you'll eventually get to the answer. And instead, I remember back in the old days, it would be like, let's go build that green button, let's scope it out, let's get this change order going and make sure that we get that big green button there. And you just wind up bolting on and building lots of unneeded software that has to get maintained over the time.
Enough about the green button. What are you trying to accomplish here? And I've said this quite a few times. I think you and I had even talked about this, but my favorite is when that conversation devolves into just like ticket numbers. And it's just, you're just talking about a ticket number at some point. You're not talking about this human that's trying to accomplish some sort of a job and get it done. I think one thing that I love is I think if we talk about the difference between back then versus now, when we think about solving for job to be done, there's a lot more focus on the experience of the employee experience of what that job is, right? I remember the days of ripping out green screen applications, and you're like, I know you stare at the screen for 20 hours a day, but here's this new solution. You're going to take it and you're going to like it, right? Rather than really focusing on that experience.
On that note, look how long it took to replace airline technology from the green screens. And it wasn't because of ease of use, it was for speed of having all those systems connected and everything. And everybody's like, you go to the airport, and even in like 2010 maybe, and you're like, I can't believe you guys are using green screens and dot matrix. And they're like, bring us something faster and we'll do it. But like, can you go faster than what we're currently using right now? And that's a good question. So, you get the UI, it starts making things slower, and at the end of the day, what's the job to be done? Like I'm at a ticket gate, and you're trying to find out when's the next available plane and get you on that thing as fast as possible, and in seconds and minutes count. So,
yeah, I think the other changes I've seen over time is I think early days it seemed like it was more do or die on your technology decisions. Which one are we going to choose? And you go through a lengthy evaluation. Whereas now it's like, pick one off, whichever one you want to pick. Just pick it, and let's move forward.
Well, you're right. There was it was like IBM and Microsoft, and then or whatever. I mean, as an example, but there weren't too many systems out there, and it was a huge investment before SaaS, right? Or in this current landscape where you had to get servers set up, and you had to have IT set up the servers, and you had to go through all of that stuff and everything, and decide do the SWOT analysis on the software and everything. Where you're right now, it's like, okay, we'll try this, but as long as there's a Zapier connection, we can swap in and swap out a piece of software if we need to, or something like that. Or now that the API, so many companies are API-centric and API-first base, you can do a better evaluation, and you can say, hey, this isn't working for us. We need to bring something else in, and it's not going to be a multi-million-dollar project to do that.
Yeah. What I love about your experience is you've led professional services within so many different SaaS companies. And what I find interesting about that's because I've always been on the outside of a software company. Yeah. But when you're in the inside running professional services, I feel like you're always in the position of wherever the promise that was made of what this software is supposed to do versus the client expectations, like that's what you need to now fill that gap. And I'm curious about that experience.
Well, and can I swear on this podcast? I'm trying to think of what's the advice?
You can. We'll just have to flag it.
It'll have the explicit rating like a Dr. Dre album. No, I won't do that.
Yeah, but maybe we'll get more interest. Yeah, Guns N' Roses.
So I do have. It's a dramatically different thing, and I've done both. I did about 4 or 5 years of before I moved into what I'm doing now, where it was building custom stuff, a bespoke software where you weren't tied to a software or SaaS company, and the difference is dramatic. My essential motto for that is don't F with the ARR, right? And so what does that mean? That means that somebody made a purchase decision to take your software on, and then they said, okay, now typically when you're selling inside the enterprise, you need integration work, definitely. If you're working for a really important software, a really valuable company, you know that you're doing really well as a company if suddenly you're integrating with other companies at an enterprise level. And so you're bringing in APIs, you're using connectors, you're doing all of these things, and you're working on, critical systems and things like that. So what I saw was that if you had project team members that were of the just very consultant mindset, but not in the SaaS company mindset, there's that pushback, and we got to write change orders, and that's not exactly what we did, and that's not the scope that we signed up for and everything. Where, sorry, I'm just thinking of all these little quotes, but like at the end of the day, they're like, hey, we want to use your crappy software, and you need to be able to integrate to do it, and we don't want you to hear you push back, or else we're not going to renew. And you have to find that line that's in between that, right? It's like, okay, we know that this is going to be valuable for you, but like, to Gantt chart them to death and to PMP them to death because they were super busy and they didn't get the files over to you. You can't be like, that's it. It's a 1 week day for day change. And by the way, there's a change order here. Like that just does not work. I mean, but you can't be subservient and just let them walk all over you. So it's a very, flexible but rigid, like it's just a malleable situation where you need to be able to say, this is how it goes and everything. And to be honest, this is still a lot of what I do for my own consulting now, because people are like, how do we do this? And it's the scoping. It's what you do as a consultant. You scope up front, you bring in your services team, and but because you're not building custom stuff, you get pretty good pattern recognition on the types of things to look for, which, to be frank, it's always about crappy data. But I'm just kidding. But but you sort of are like, okay, let's not overwhelm them with stuff, but let's bring up the top 5 problems that always come up on any enterprise integration and go from there. And get a very friendly architect on the phone. And just have them walk through these types of questions. Hey, can you send over a data sample? Hey, we're trying to do this. Do you've got permissions around X? Do you those types of things. Do you have read write and all those types of questions? And then suddenly you can make it less painful, so the sales team does not mind bringing in services into the pre-sales, and then you're able to set up a contract that allows you to start the engagement off right. They don't feel like you're going to be change ordering them, because I tell you what happens if you don't do this. And the problem I always get called in to solve is that it's a smaller software company. They signed everything up. CEO said, don't worry about it. We'll take care of it with professional services. And the professional services comes in and they're like, that's not a 2-month job. That's a 6-month job. And we're going to have to change order like $50,000 or something like that.
Oh, crap.
Well, but and the customer's like, too bad. I already asked for my budget for your crappy software, and we're not getting any more. So you kind of have to figure out how to make it happen. And that happens. I've been brought in. That happens. They'll have 10 existing customers that are going through that. And what should have been a 4-month engagement are turning into 10 months. And then suddenly they're not collecting any MRR or ARR from these customers, and the finance team's wondering, why can't they send invoices? And it's a huge problem. So that's the big difference between hey, we're going to come in for a 6-week discovery, scope it out, and then start building up a nice little framework for us to start this nice, multi-month, multi-year engagement, versus working for a SaaS company and trying to do minimum viable possible so they can start getting their time to value using your software so you can renew it.
But Jeff, I'm paying $2 million a year in licensing fees. Can't you just make my data work? Shouldn't it just all work right away?
Yeah, that's the rub right there. And that's where you have to have these conversations internally at your software company to say, do you want to carve that out of the software fee? Do you want to do X? Do you want to do Y? Or, hey, product team, make it easier to integrate. We're seeing that we're having to do the same transformation of data. So maybe you could build an ETL layer in there, and then it's very smooth, and you don't even need professional services, so people can sign up faster and we can recognize revenue faster, which is always my go-to, like fixed product. Like get it, If it's one-off bespoke, it's like, then you tell them, like, and I've had those conversations with customers, and they're like, whoa, wait, you're telling me we're the only customer like that? And where you're basically saying, like, yeah, you're the crazy one, right? You're the one that you're the one whose stuff is so bad that it's in the situation. You have to be able to have those conversations in a way where it's like, listen, yeah, you can clean your data, or we can clean your data if that's the situation, or you can build a connector, we can build a connector, or whatever the problem set has to be. And if it happens 3, 4, 5 times, then suddenly that's when you start bringing into the product is like, hey, by the way, everybody's using Salesforce. Maybe we need a Salesforce adapter or something like that.
Yeah. It's not us, it's you. And what I found too, there's all these ebbs and swells where as over the years, as organizations go through various stages of transformation, which is, first there's a reliance on professional services firms, and then there's let's bring a lot of this in-house.
Yep.
There's been various eras where major software vendors, they're really pushing their own professional services firms versus leveraging other partners. And, you and I have been on different sides, because I can tell you, we've been called in many times to because when they've gotten annoyed with the professional services as the software vendor, right? But being on different angles, I wonder if there's some stories from the field, tips and tricks on how these organizations can better leverage professional services firms, or things not to do when leveraging.
Well, we did this, right? With you when I was at Bright Cove, where it was like, we can't have a huge team. So just for people who are unaware of this, if you are a software company and you want to eventually get sold or go public, if your professional services is too high as a SaaS company, they're going to say, no, you're not a SaaS company, you are a services company. So I think it's when I was at Bright Cove, it was probably around a 25 or 30% mark. Like, you do not cross that mark, where they're basically saying, like, your services team makes too much money. And so, but we're like, we need to get all these customers up and live, and they like to use our team because we have a lot of experience in that. And what we wound up doing and using companies like yours was to say, hey, listen, we have a small team. We would like to dedicate our small team to just working on new and big problems. But we also have some sort of productionalized professional services packages to get your team so you can become experts on that. So 2 notes on that. It doesn't have to be exactly a product set, but if you keep bumping into the same problem, like for us, it was like we're building the same video portal over and over and over and over again. George, do you want to do that? And if I'm George, any other company, it's basically like, sure, can you give us enough business so that we can dedicate somebody to that? And that's a good thing for the professional services vendor to ask, because if, we were talking about Bright Cove as the example, but whatever company is like, we're going to get you all trained up on Bright Cove, and you dedicate you get maybe a PM and a software developer in there, or maybe a whole team, and they work on a project, and then another one doesn't pop up and they forget everything. And then we call you up 8 months later and you're like, oh, we got too much work going on. You're like, yeah, we don't have the right. So there depends on the volume of stuff that comes in, but it's basically like, first of all, if I'm calling up, your company to help me out of a delivery problem, like, I will fight to death on this with internally inside the software company that I work for. Don't start making George sell my software. That's not a delivery problem you're trying to solve. You're trying to solve a sales problem. And I hate that, because it's like, oh, well, let's give them some skin in the game. Let's see if they can get their customers to start using our stuff. And I'm like, that's not what we're trying to solve here. So my tip there is that if you're a software company and your services team is overwhelmed and you need a good batch of partners to do, bring them in and start funneling business over to them, and don't make them carry a quota, because that's trying to solve for a different problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think there are times, though, where not necessarily to sell your product, but to level up the product value. Right, because I can't tell you how many times I've gone in and I have a client. They want to buy this software platform. The software platform wants to sell it to the client, but they haven't. Neither one of them have been able to justify it within the overall org. But when you can now paint the picture of, if we plug this into this overall change plan and this overall kind of transformation, now it turns into this key that unlocks all this other stuff that maybe wouldn't have happened with such a myopic view of it.
1000% agree. And I still think that's a different problem that's being solved. Like, that is you as your company saying, we've got a palette of different things that we're trying to do to help you as a company out. And like, oh, you need a video strategy. Okay, we'll bring in this. Or you need an accounting platform. We know which is the best accounting platform to do. But that is not that accounting platform to say, hey, George, I'm not going to kick you any more services revenue unless you bring us 10 new clients. I just don't agree with that thing. It's like,
right.
I brought George in because I don't have a big enough team, and we're being told not to hire anymore because I'm making too much money, or we don't want to be seen as a service company. We just don't want a large services business. We want to work on a smaller set of clients, but maybe work on the next gen thing that we want to do, like the big problem, and then get these repeatable solutions for somebody else to go deliver on.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of an executive at an organization going through some sort of change. They bought some software from software vendor X. They've got their professional services team in. They've maybe got someone like us in there as well. What should those executives do better? How can they be better in leveraging our firms?
Yeah.
Just be better.
Be better? Well, as you know, I'm a big fan of the M&M cookie at the kickoff meeting, so always make sure you feed the consultants well. But so be informed. In order to be a better customer, you have to be involved, and you need to. What am I trying to go for here? Is basically say be involved in the project, and also be meeting the vendor every step of the way. The classic example I'll give on this is like you have a kickoff meeting and they don't bring the right people to the kickoff meeting, and they haven't explained the reason why they're bringing the software stuff in. So then as a vendor, you might have a project manager and a bunch of developers suddenly start doing the sales thing, like, no, well, we can do X and we can do Y, because it hasn't been explained better to them, right? So that's like step number one. And then it's like making sure that they have the right amount of resources associated with the product and everything. I will say 1,000% the biggest problem I ever see is by the time you start building stuff, and now it's an agile thing, so you want to get like business process testing in a repeatable fashion, and having people actually go in and do those things. And we joked about this of like having to have like pizza parties where people come in and start like going through and kicking around in the software and stuff like that, because we need a dedicated hour from 10 or 15 different people. And that tells me like you have to bribe their employees because they don't understand what the importance of it is for their job that they need to get to be done. If you're talking about the example where it's software vendor X's professional services company, and then your company's also working in there, like, well, don't paint an adversarial relationship between the two vendor companies, right? Like, and that happens just so much where like, oh, I don't know about George and what he's got going on with his team, X, Y, and Z. It's like, that is not the way to get successful stuff, like pitting vendors against each other. I actually have not, if you asked me 3 months ago, I say I haven't seen that much at all recently, but it still happens. And it's happening on a project that I've seen very recently. And that's just one of those things. Don't meeting the teams to death and put this massive governance structure in where it's not as important. I understand having status meetings and everything like that, but like over or micromanaging all of the vendors and all of the teams is just, that's going to what's drive your cost up and then slow things down as well too. People don't do that. It's a level of trust that you have to build up so the software vendor and the services company need to make sure that they can establish trust and credibility fast, so that they feel like they don't have 3 to 5 check-ins every week because the customer feels like that's the only way that they're going to get answers. That's just a huge problem, right? Like, everybody needs to be better about communication and things like that. So those are some of the areas where I see companies have to do it. But like, there's nothing worse than the business owner that signs the check or signs the contract and then just disappears. And you need decisions to be made, and they can't be making decisions. And unfortunately, that's why every contract that I've ever written has like response time on questions with, maybe not even dollar charges, but like time charge. This will push things out if we don't have the answers to the questions that we need. For when critical things pop up and everything.
Yeah, because as the client, you have the vision, or hopefully you do have the vision, because you're spending a bunch of money, right? One would hope, but no one. You need to be an advocate for your own vision, and that requires. I don't care how scoped out something is. I don't care how planned out it is. Like, you need to carry that vision into all of the various touch points and the meetings. And if you don't have the time, you can't do this, then you need to start going hip to hip with someone that you know is going to be able to absorb that vision and carry it through. I think some of the best successes we've had is where someone on my team or myself is like, you get enough time in at the beginning and along the way that now you can kind of be a proxy in a room for that client that has the vision, and they feel confident that you have the same exact vision.
Is there any bigger unicorn than that, like business analysts that can get that vision down and then break it down? And business analyst is what I'm using as sort of a generalized function instead of the term, and then be able to relate those business terms back to the tech people to say, like, no, this is where we need to do it in the technology. Like, if you find those people, they're just unicorns, because they can take that vision and they understand everything that needs to go, and then they can start the blocking and tackling with the tech and the business teams to make sure that the requirements are broken down in a way that the tech teams can understand what they need to go build without having to go through just back and forth on requirement, clarifications and everything.
Yeah. The moment that you can feel comfortable not being in the room is such a relief at that point, right?
Yep. Yeah. How do you address that now? Are you just getting hip to hip in the beginning, and you're making sure that you're just understanding 1,000% what they're trying to do and repeating it back to them? And I'm just curious on your approach on that.
Yeah, I think back to your, what you said before, as far as you got to form a team of one across yourself and the client and whatever other partners or software vendors are in there. A lot of upfront time, workshopping it and talking about what the future is and what the vision is and what's it going to be like to live in this new environment. So it's kind of less about scope at that point, right? And features, and it's more about let's talk about what a shared vision of the future is, and then always carrying that through along the way. And then, going out to some restaurants and having some drinks and getting to know someone at a more personal level also helps.
That's the big problem with the way things are these days. With if people are listening to this in 10 years, there's somewhat of a pandemic going on, and it's not easy to go out and do the restaurant thing and things like that. But what is that? That's a relationship, right? That's a relationship, and that's why those things are most important, because it's important to build relationships outside of just the hour meeting and go from there. And that's why those things are important.
Yeah, because in those dinners and those drinks or whatever you're doing outside of the office, that's when you start telling each other what your fears are. That's where you start telling people, well, what am I measured on? What am I afraid of? What's going to happen? What are these like disaster scenarios that could happen? And our best successes are when, you really let down that guard on both sides to talk about, how am I measured? What are my fears?
You just hit on something that relate this back to the SaaS world instead of the Bespoke world, but it relates to both. I just, when you've got a lot of project managers report to you, it becomes you've got the psychiatrist's office. People are just walking in and they're like, oh my God, I just got off a status call and blah, blah, and they're just hammering me and X, Y, and Z. And it's exactly what you just said there. Like, let's peel this back here. Why do you think this person is unloading on you? They're scared. They are sitting on top of a big project that somebody's paying, that their boss or their boss's boss has paid a lot of money, or they made a decision, or their boss made a decision to go forward with your software or this project to be built. And now they're scared for some reason. Maybe timeline's unclear. Maybe technology decisions are unclear. They're at a point where they're not sure which way they should go or whatever. But the fact of the matter is these people are suddenly scared, and they are letting out on you. And the best thing you can do is feel the empathy for the client. And that was super important in the SaaS world, because it's like, again, they made especially when you're working in all startups, it's like they went with us instead of the industry standard, and they are now scared because they could have just gone with the industry standard and been fine, but they didn't, and they took a chance with us. So we need to be better about our reporting. Like, did you send your status report out 24 hours in advance, or did you just drop a bomb on them in the meeting? Like, let's, all these things, right? Like, so let's not do that, and let's be open and communicative. Like, I would always tell my teams, if you got some bad news, first of all, you probably found out there was an idea that there might be some bad news before way before it popped up. Somebody should be saying like, this could be an issue later on. And just popping these things up early, because if you raise something up as an issue 2, 3, 4, 6 weeks before it happens, it's there and people can understand it. If you're like, hey, there's a massive problem. We were supposed to deliver this tomorrow, but now it's going to be 3 weeks late. And it's like, really? 3 weeks late? Like, you're just finding that out today on our status call? It's like... And so open transparency. As you can tell, I'm very tactical, so I'm sure you can pull these things up into the more strategic sense.
Well, I think we've created the perfect formula. You need to be an advocate for your own vision, and you need to tell us your deepest, darkest fears and secrets, and then all will be well. And I think both of us as professional services executives, we give everyone out there permission that if you have a consultant that comes into your status meeting and all of a sudden something switched from green to red, and this is the first time you're hearing about it, you can throw them out the window on behalf of all consultants out there. You have permission.
Drives me crazy. I believe I said this on the podcast, but for those people who aren't following me from podcast to podcast, I remember that there was a project manager that used to sit in the cube next to me, and I remember her being on the phone with the developer, and she's like, okay, it's 12:50. I'm not lying. I'm not making this up. It's 12:58. The meeting starts at 1 o'clock. I'm going to hit the status. I'm going to hit it. I'm going to send it right now. And then they hit it, and then she started up the conference meeting. And I'm like, I'm like, never, ever, ever do that to anybody. Like, that's just the worst thing you can. Let's drop a big bomb on them, but like, let's bury it in a status report, and hopefully it doesn't come up on the call. Like, So, anyways, I digress. But yes, you've got 100,000% permission to throw that person out of a window if you need to.
You heard it here first, folks. All right, Jeff. So, anything else from the don't do this with consultants that you could think of before we wrap up?
A whole podcast series in themselves, but like, it's just don't hide the messages. Be open and transparent. Bring problems up when there's a little bit of smoke, and if they got resolved, then that's great. Like, hey, that problem, we resolved that. Oh, great, that's great. Yeah, but we got this other thing that's hanging out there. Let's take care of it. So I'm just big on the open and the communication. Scope stuff out in advance. Don't bill hourly. No, just kidding. But in general, do your upfront work as much as you can. If you're working for a software company. Have that flexibility that you need to do, but make sure you don't get subservient and have some things in process to be able to take care of these inevitable things that pop up when they do, because it's software and stuff happens. So
that's great advice. And on that note, I'd like to end with Jeff. What's the best advice you have ever personally received?
Oh my God, ever, or just in business, or
ever in life, anything?
So I'm trying to keep this clean because my dad was like a plumber from Chelsea and from Korean War. So like I'm trying. It's funny because the best piece of advice that keeps popping into my head, maybe not. Well, I was running services, so but there was a situation where, the situation was about like a promotional type of situation. But at the end of the day, I could not get my boss, my manager, to do something that was super critical to me. And even though the manager agreed that thing should happen. And I went to my mentor, and I think everybody should have a mentor. Maybe I should just say always have a mentor and just sign off. But like my mentor said to me, okay, if this thing keeps dragging out and they've already agreed that it's the right thing to do, you put it at the top of your list every time you meet with this person, which should be weekly. And then the next time you meet with them, you say, listen, you either can't do something about it or you won't do something about it. And I brought that into that meeting, and the person was offended yet proud at the same time, which was like, wow, I can't believe you raised it up to like, this like Survivor, like tribal council level of stuff. But, but she was like, tough negotiator, I understand, and then that thing happened, and that person always respected me more because you took a stand for myself and things like that, but didn't do it in an over emotional manner. So.
Yeah, I love that. It's hard to argue, right? You either can or you won't. There's no arguments in between there. Yeah. All right. Well, I love it, Jeff. Thanks so much for being here. Really had a great time.
Same here, man. Appreciate it. Thanks a lot.